Alright, so in the last video I did a bunch of stuff in Excel because I thought that it was way easier to start off this introduction to the two-nation model, or what is sometimes called the two-large nation model, by working with tables. And I like to work with tables in Excel way more than kind of trying to write out straight lines and draw the entire thing out here. But the one disadvantage of working in Excel is that then I can't draw on any of the graphs that I make. So we're going to go ahead and bring this back into this blackboard, and then we're going to work in here just a little bit so that I can draw on the graphs and kind of give you just a little bit stronger intuition for what's going on. So just to reiterate, this is the exact same table that I had in Excel in the last video. This was the Chinese market, and then I'll try and even keep the colors as similar as I can, and then this was the American market. So this is the dividing line right here, and I should probably make that a little bit clearer. So this is the dividing line right here. To the left of that black line is the Chinese market, and to the right of that black line is the American market. Alright, so I have a bunch of things here that I've gone ahead and copied over, so it takes up a lot of space, and I'm going to try and focus your attention where it needs to be just by moving the screen around. So with the Chinese market, we can either figure out what the equilibrium will be by using the table, just by working over here, or we could do it graphically. And so I tried to explain both using the table and graphically in Excel, but I definitely think that I fell a little bit short of doing a good job of making this clear graphically, simply because I couldn't draw on the graph. So the equilibrium is going to be where, just to reiterate again, this is supply and this is demand, and I actually think I have those, yeah, so I have those labels down here. But the equilibrium would be where supply is equal to demand, which is right here. So we would go down, and that would give us our equilibrium quantity, and then we could go over, and that would give us our equilibrium price. And so we don't have an exact measure on that graph just because of the way the table is made, or because of the way the graph is made in Excel. But if we go up to this table, we know that at $3, China demands 80 toys and produces 90 toys. So we know then that there is still a little bit of a surplus. So the price is going to be just a little bit less, and I'll just write this out. P is just a little less than $3. Now in the USA, I went ahead and shrunk this graph from the one that I presented in Excel because I thought that it would be better if I could make these all uniform and have the axes the same for a later part in this video. So just on this table over here, we can see that there is no equilibrium. Even at $9, there are 300 toys demanded in the USA, and there are only 85 toys supplied. But we're going to go ahead and just work with this anyways, because I didn't want to extend this table all the way down because that would take up too much room, and I also wanted to leave the graph the same size as the Chinese graph. So if we were to just extend this supply line, or that would be the supply line, up like this. Actually, I'm not going to make it that long because we're already kind of running out of space. And then extend the demand line. I remember just from the last video that those intersect at $15, and I don't remember exactly what the quantity was. But the beautiful thing is that that's not important. So the quantity is somewhere between 100 and 200. It looks like a little bit more than 150, but it's just eyeballing. If you really want to know, you can go back and look at the last video and just get it from there. But the part that I wanted to go ahead and do out here for you guys is construct the world supply and demand curves using just the Chinese and the American demand curves, because I think that that's kind of, the intuition is kind of lost when I just do that copy and paste in Excel. So for the world then, remember, we are in this model, we're assuming there are only two nations in the world. And this is just for simplicity. It can easily be expanded to have 3 nations, 4 nations, every single nation that is in the world. You're just going to have to add up a lot of different stuff. But you get all of the intuition and all of the analysis from just using 2 nations. So we do 2 to start just because it's much simpler, and then it's not a problem to do more than 2 if you really need to for something that you're doing in the real world. So then we're just going to go ahead and make our demand curve, our quantity demanded, and I'll do supply in a different color, our supply curve, quantity supplied. So if there are only 2 nations in the world, there's only the USA and China in this world market for toys, which is what we were talking about last time, and I didn't copy that over, so I'll write it. So remember, we're talking about toys here. Then the quantity demanded in the entire world will just be the sum of the amount demanded in China and the amount demanded in the USA. So for this first row, it's just going to be, this will just be 100 plus 500. So that gets us a quantity demanded of 600. And then for supply, that's just going to be 10 plus 5, which is going to be 15. Going down to the next row, I'll change up colors again. We're going to have 90 at a price of $2. China demands 90 toys. The USA demands 475. And 90 plus 475, I can't do in my head. So we have 565. And then the quantity supplied will be 50 plus 15, which is 65. So I actually think that I'm not going to go ahead and calculate this all the way down. But from the last video, you know what, it's good exercise for you to do it, and I'll go ahead and do one more row. How about that? And then I think that I'm just going to be wasting your time if I keep on doing this mental math that I'm very slow at. So at a price of $3, the world will demand, China will demand 80 toys, the US will demand 450 toys. So the world, which is just China and plus the US, will demand 530. If I am doing my math correctly, which I think I am. Yeah, I should be. And then the world will supply, China will supply 90, and the USA will supply 25. So in the world, we will have 115 toys supplied. So if you go ahead and add all those up all the way down, you'll find out that the equilibrium is at a price of $8. And this I just know from the last video that I did in Excel, where China will demand 30 toys, and the USA will demand 325. So in whole, we will have 355 demanded, and then China will supply 280, and the USA will supply 75, and 280 plus 75 is also 355. So in the world, we have an equilibrium. There are 355 toys produced, and there are 355 toys purchased or demanded. So that tells us then that our equilibrium is this one right here. And bear with me. So if we know that this row represents our equilibrium, and that last line I'm going to redo so you can still see the 75. If that row represents our equilibrium, then we can go down graphically, and we can also do this numerically, which I'll do afterwards, but I'm going to do it graphically first. We can go and see that in the world market, we have an equilibrium at a price of $8, and that just gets us to this $8 right here, and a quantity of 355. Now, if we go over to the other two graphs, the American market, we get this point here and this point here. And if we go over to the Chinese market, then we get that point there and this point right here. So this is the quantity demanded in China, and I'll put a C up there for China. And then this is the quantity supplied in China. And then over here, we have the quantity supplied in the US, and we have the quantity demanded in the US. And using these, we can calculate who is going to be the exporter and who is going to be the importer. So the US then is going to only supply this much. This is the quantity supplied for the US, which is just what I wrote up there. And they're going to demand, or they're going to consume, this many toys. Quantity demanded for the US. So what they demand is greater than how much they produce. So the only way that you can consume more than you produce is if you import. And then the way that we see that numerically is this is 325, and I'm just getting that from right here. And then this right here is 75, which I'm getting from right there. And if we take 325 and we subtract 75, we are going to get 250. So the US is going to import 250 toys. Now we can go do the exact same thing for China, or we can say because there are only two nations in this world, we know that China is going to export 250. But just to go ahead and double check, if we go over to the Chinese market, we know that this right here is 30, coming from this cell right there. So the Chinese, at a price of $8, the Chinese demand 30 toys. And we know that this right here is 280. So the Chinese demand 280 toys. So the difference then is going to be how much they export. And again, here's the reasoning. The Chinese, at a price of $8, which is the world equilibrium because it is free to trade between the Chinese and the US, the Chinese will produce 280 toys, and China only wants to consume, the Chinese citizens only want to consume 30 toys. So if the Chinese only want to consume 30 toys, but the Chinese factories want to produce 280 toys, the only way that these Chinese factories are going to be able to sell those goods is if they export them. And we can easily see 280 minus 30 is equal to 250. So the last way is that using a table, you would just take this value right here and this value right here and subtract them. And we have 280 minus 30 is 250. So I just want to reiterate, just run through this model really quickly one more time because we have all the pieces here together in a way that I think is pretty coherent. So the first thing is we assume that there are only two nations in the world, and then the other assumption, which I didn't write down but I've talked about a bunch, is that trade doesn't cost anything. So I'll just write no trade costs. No trade costs. So if there are no trade costs and there are only two nations in the world, then each of them are going to have a domestic demand and a domestic supply function. And so those are given here. This is the domestic demand for in China for toys and the domestic supply function in China for toys. Then over here we have the domestic demand function in the USA for toys and the domestic demand function in the USA the domestic supply function in the USA for toys. So if trade has no cost whatsoever, then we're going to have one world market, because USA producers of toys can sell their toys in China, and Chinese producers can go ahead and sell their toys in the USA. And from the demand point of view, US consumers can purchase Chinese toys with no additional costs, and Chinese consumers can purchase American toys at no additional cost. So when we go ahead and find out what the world demand is by adding the Chinese demand to the American demand and the world supply, the exact same argument that we used to make when we first introduced supply and demand, that if there's a surplus, we're going to have to lower the price, and if there's a shortage, we're going to have to raise the price, applies to the entire world. And so that brings us to this point right here, where the world supply is equal to the world demand for toys. And then at that price, we go evaluate the domestic markets. So we go back to evaluate the American market and the Chinese market. And we see that in the American market, at a price of $8, that the US will import 250 toys because their demand, the American domestic demand, exceeds the American domestic supply by 250. In other words, Americans want to buy 250 more toys than Americans want to produce. And in China, it's the exact opposite. At a price of $8, the Chinese only want to purchase 30 toys, but the Chinese want to make 280 toys. So since the Chinese want to make more than the Chinese want to buy, the Chinese export the extra, or they export 250 toys. And since there are only two nations in the world, we know that those exports are going to the other nation, which is the United States. So that is absolutely everything that I want to say about the two large nation model of trade. I hope that that was really, really clear. If it wasn't, please let me know. And that's really all that I'm going to work with this.